Just moments ago, Paul Manafort's lawyers say they are, and I'm quoting basically their arguments, worried about Paul Manafort's current safety behind bars, a serious thing for any lawyer to file. The context is that earlier today, a judge was ordering Manafort to be moved to a new jail as he awaits his much-anticipated trial, which that itself might seem like a win for Manafort's team. His lawyers have been arguing the current jail was too far away for their preparations, but now they have apparently changed their minds. Here it is. Moments ago, Manafort's lawyers asked the judge to let him stay where he is, saying moving could risk his safety. Quote, concerns about his safety. Also today, guilty Trump aide Michael Flynn back in court. And this is the first time since he was in court long ago in December to plead guilty in the first place. His lawyer telling the judge that Flynn is cooperating and is eager to move on to the sentencing phase. No sign, though, of what will transpire. All of that is the backdrop, the legal wrangling of these different Trump aides, one guilty, one in denial, maintaining his innocence, with someone else breaking their silence who is key to Mueller's investigation, a Russian who is admitting setting up that now infamous meeting at Trump Tower. Russian pop star Emin Agalarov, who's been linked to Trump, confirming in a new interview with Vice News that it was his father, a Russian oligarch, who asked him to organize this meeting between Trump Jr. and that infamous Kremlin-linked lawyer. But they denied knowing who was really behind all of it and laughed off accusations that there was any attempt to influence the U.S. election.
I've been accused of influencing it's going to sound very strange, influencing the American election, me, this guy here from Azerbaijan living in Moscow, because I know personally Mr. Donald Trump, who is the current president of the United States, for those that are not familiar with that. Just because he appeared in one of my videos and I hosted with him Miss Universe in 2013 in Moscow. Okay, cut. Apparently, during those 3 days, we've rigged the American election and helped him become president of the United States. So it's quite strange and ridiculous acquisition.
He may be a little more lawyerly than he looks, because what was just said is not, of course, precisely the accusation. And what's strange is the meeting that was orchestrated at Trump Tower. On that, he is not saying much, although there is, of course, some attempt here to come out of the woodwork, because in a new interview with ABC, he won't explain why an aide to his father's business attended the Trump Tower meeting, also would not comment on the substance of the meeting, which is pretty important, but notes something that everyone has been tracking here in the United States. He asserts that he has not spoken to Mueller. I'm joined now by former Watergate Special Prosecutor Nick Ackerman, David Rothkopf, a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Frank Figliuzzi, a former Assistant FBI Director for Counterintel. Several topics to get to within some of the developing news tonight, but Nick, let's begin with what Paul Manafort's lawyers are doing.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, they really wanted to get him closer to the courthouse just because it's a major pain in the neck to have to travel all that distance. Once you get to a prison, you've got to go through a whole security procedure. You've got to be allowed into the prison. You go through several different doors that lock behind you, and then you've got to wait for your client to show up. It's not an easy thing to prepare for trial on a defendant who is incarcerated.
When they say concerns about his safety, what are we to make of that?
Well, it's not just his safety. They said it was also because he didn't want to get used to a new place. So for him, you don't know if it was concerns about his safety or he just didn't want to go to a new hotel that he wasn't used to. I mean, you really can't tell from that. I mean, if I were the judge and looking at this, I'd say the guy just doesn't want to move and he's comfortable where he is right now. And he really doesn't care if his lawyers have to travel and go through all that grief to get to him to prepare.
Frank, Nick may be using the words comfortable and hotel loosely. Given my familiarity with federal detention facilities, they're not easy, especially if you're not accustomed to them. But what do you think Paul Manafort's lawyers are doing here, and why this kind of wrangling? Typically in a high-profile case, you try to minimize pretrial motions that could be misinterpreted and focus on getting your client ready.
Something's not right with this picture, Ari. So it's totally understandable that they'd want proximity to their lawyers. They'd want proximity to D.C. So I get that motion. That makes sense to me. This last-minute development that now somehow Alexandria is not going to be sufficient, and maybe because of its safety, doesn't ring true. And here's why. Some of the most notorious Washington, D.C. area subjects, detainees, including Robert Hanssen, notorious spy, FBI executive, were housed there temporarily, and they did okay. You can segregate people appropriately. So this sounds to be more, as Nick is saying, is some kind of Manafort issue or quirk where he just doesn't want to be moved right now. And some of this may be spin, where we're seeing a public they want to let the public think he's some kind of beleaguered victim that gets moved around and is somehow in danger.
And this goes, Nick, to the two chess pieces that seem to me to be very important on the board. What happens to Paul Manafort's trial, and does it put extra pressure on him? And what happens in, of course, Michael Cohen's situation as he continues to speak out and say that maybe he won't be so loyal to Donald Trump anymore? The way they put it, again, when sometimes people watch, they say, why is there more news about Paul Manafort? Well, because of what Paul Manafort's doing. I just want to, in fairness, read exactly what he says. In light of Manafort's continuing detention and after further reflection, his lawyers say issues of distance and inconvenience must yield to concerns about his safety and, more importantly, the challenges he will face, as you put it, Nick, in adjusting to a new place of confinement and the changing circumstances of detention 2 weeks before trial. Put this in the broader context of what we're going to see if the trial starts on time and the kind of case they have against him, which, as I understand it, has a lot of paper evidence that's bad for him.
That's right. I mean, it's not. I think the trial is going to move ahead. He's got another motion to try and change the venue to another location in Virginia because there are more Democrats supposedly in the district where he's going to be tried in Alexandria. The fact of the matter is that will all be taken care of during the jury voir dire when they pick the jury and question the jurors. Mueller has already submitted to the judge a pretty extensive questionnaire that will really be able to ferret out anybody who cannot be fair and impartial. They ask all kinds of questions that the jurors will be able to write down their answers to. So I think what you're going to see is this trial is going ahead. In truth and reality, the lawyers probably do not need that much time with Manafort anymore. It is a document case. I mean, there is no cross-examination of witnesses. You can't cross-examine a document. The document speaks for itself, and they're just going to be putting into evidence one document after another. In terms of any kind of real defense here, the defense that the lawyers, he relied on lawyers, they've got him lying to the lawyers.
And before I go to David on the foreign policy, you don't think they'll put Paul Manafort on the stand, do you?
Oh, I would never think that he'd take the stand.
Yeah,
I mean, they would just then take all of the documents again and put them under his face and say, did you sign this? Did you sign this?
Right.
Did you sign that? And he'd have to. If he doesn't admit it, then he's going to look like a total fool. And if he does admit it, he's going to look like a fool, too, because he's guilty.
David, I come to you with another character in this international tour of mystery. The Agalarovs are not household names in America, although there is an international entertainment quality to it all.
Have you heard this guy sing?
I like music. I haven't heard his work that much.
Yeah, no, if you had, you would know why he wasn't a household name.
Well, there you go. A little shade, a little Rolling Stone side of it. Walk us through what's important here and the way he seems to be, to put it bluntly, playing dumb.
Well, I'm not sure he's playing dumb. But I think that, he has to admit his role. He admitted it in this Vice thing, and then went on to deny, any of the substance. I think his sort of laughing off the idea that he was trying to manipulate the election is in itself laughable. Of course he wasn't. The Russian government was doing it. The Russian government asked his father to set up the meeting. It was part of a pattern of efforts that the Russian government has undertaken in order to manipulate the election. He is a bit carrier. He has a bit part in this. He's this kind of a spear carrier in this, and he will disappear into the midst. But we're so hungry these days for any bit of information that moves us a little closer to understanding what the Russian timeline was, what the Russians were, that we sort of grab onto it. But
hungry and thirsty.
Yeah, well, I think that the reality is he's going to fade back into the background pretty soon, and we are going to get on to the Manafort trial, which is going to reveal a great deal, and then we're going to get to the next phases of the Mueller investigation.
I also wonder what it would be like. This is sort of more of a psychological question, but given your familiarity with that part of the world, we have read accounts that Russia and other countries use intermediaries, cutouts, and assets, and there's this term, unwitting asset, right, to get things done. I guess you could imagine that certain people end up in that situation, and then afterward they're sort of hearing about themselves, and they don't know what to believe. Were they an unwitting asset or not?
Well, I think that's right, and I think that what we've seen, and all the evidence points to it with regard to the meddling in the U.S. election, is that the Russians were doing everything in their power to put their thumb on the scale of the elections. They were channeling money to Trump through the NRA, through other areas. They were using cyber. They were using information warfare. They were using trolls. They were setting up these meetings. They were reaching out through WikiLeaks. They were reaching out through pressure from oligarchs, whether it's Deripaska with Manafort or others. They were trying to put their people in place. Every place they could get their sort of claws into this, they tried to get their claws into it. It was comprehensive. It's not to say that it was all coordinated. You know, they didn't know what was going to work and what wasn't going to work.
Right, they were throwing a lot at the wall. With that in mind, Frank, also take a listen to his discussion about one of the more salacious and completely unverified parts of the dossier in this new interview.
Mr. Trump came to Moscow with 87 most beautiful ladies in the world of that year. Miss Brazil, Miss Argentina, Miss USA, Miss Great Britain, Miss blah, blah, blah. And even if I were to even think that, I would never even offer it because I can never live up to the high level of the most amazing and beautiful women surrounding us constantly. I think any really successful people are interested in buying sex.
Right.
So look, we just talked about cutouts and co-optees and bit players, and this young man's having his 15 minutes of fame, but he wouldn't know what happened that night at that hotel room, or whether the bodyguard of Trump was approached and this offer was made or not. And we just can't believe him, nor can we expect that he would know everything the Russian intelligence service is doing. What I took out of this interview, by the way, of this young man was further confirmation, where he says that the Trump campaign approached the Russians needing help to get the Russian-American vote, and that's when they got hooked up with VK, this Russian social media entity. That was an interesting statement. This business of I don't know anything about prostitutes at the Ritz-Carlton Moscow, it means nothing.
Yeah, I mean, briefly, what does that even mean, that you'd want a foreign country's help to get the foreign or immigrant nationals in this country to vote for you? It's weird.
Well, so I wonder if he needed help with Italian Americans or Polish Americans, for that matter, and why the focus on Russian Americans, and why he asked this young man, let's make sure that we invite Putin to the Miss Universe pageant. Something not right with this picture. Why the focus on Russians? We'll figure that out, and that's what Mueller's working on.
Right. I mean, it's almost it's the kind of defense that's so dumb you feel dumb disproving it. But to extend your logic, there are many Hispanic American people in the United States with links to Mexico that vote. There was not the same operation here to get help from the Mexican government, to say the least. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.